Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
Think back to our own Constitution or our Declaration of Independence that way, that we hold certain truths to be self-evident, that everybody in the human community ought to be able to see that people have certain unalienable rights.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Father Charles Ritter, Director of the Office of Community Relations for the Diocese of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik and Father Charles Ritter discuss human rights, economical and social. Now, here's Father Bacik.
Chuck, you've had a long history of involvement with human rights matters. You've been on the firing line. I can remember times when you were under great criticism for standing up for certain groups and so on and trying to mediate disputes. In your job with the Office of Community Relations, you find yourself in the middle very often, but I think you've been pretty consistent from my viewpoint in trying to protect human rights and uphold the dignity of people, working out of our Christian heritage. And it's that which moves me to want to speak with you a bit about the whole question of human rights, and I'd like to speak about them especially in terms of cultural kinds of rights and more economic rights. Now, to set a little of background for that, it seems to me here in the United States that we have a long history of respect for political and civil rights. We've worked hard at that. We've had high ideals in that regard. We've had our failures. We've denied the vote to people at times. But eventually we seem to be catching up with our ideals that all human beings, every citizen in the United States has certain rights to free speech, to assembly, to partake in representative government, to vote, and so on. And that that is sort of part of our American outlook, I think, and is the way we tend to look at human life. But when you start looking at other kinds of rights, the rights that are connected with the economic world and with the cultural life, I'm not sure that we have such a strong feeling for that. We don't have a long tradition that way, and these are a lot of new ideas coming out around the notion of economic rights. Of course, it doesn't mean we've had a history of the labor unions that has been impressive in our country and so on, but I feel we have a long ways to go on this question of economic rights, and that's where I'd like to focus in our discussion.
I think the point we talked about last time when we said that, rights in any culture, in any society, there's a developmental thing. At some point, somebody raises up the idea that says, gee, we think people ought to have such and such a right, and the general reaction is probably, well, you're crazy, we can't run things that way. And then little bit by little, the idea gets talked about and then becomes incorporated in some of the processes and structures of society and maybe eventually down the line codified by law. And there were times as we go back into our own history, as I say, it's a deep history of political and civil rights where some of the things that we simply now take for granted and are protected by law in our country were considered rather harebrained ideas. I think we're moving on. We're saying that human existence is more than just the fundamentals of, the right to stay alive, the right to legal protection. That to be fully human is to look at, all of those dimensions of human life that are part of developing into the fullness of our capacity and potential as people. The right to develop ourselves through our work, the whole developmental process that education involves, the right to the whole areas of development in terms of arts and culture. And that those are not fringe kinds of things, that they are inherent to being human and to the full development of human person.
That's well said. The stark contrast to looking at people who are starving in Africa today and who don't have the minimum kinds of sustenance, just to barely stay alive, they are faced with one set of rights questions. The right to just pure life. And yet, it seems as society advances, as you get to more affluent countries, and as you look at our specific situation in the United States, it is not really a matter just of having enough food to survive today. It's an idea of living what we would call a fully human life. A life that has decency connected with it, in which the spirit of the human person can be developed, in which the arts can be developed, where we have the right to participate in the cultural life of the country, rights to education, to develop our potential, and so on. And then you get, a much more advanced kind of notion. But I think that's where we are in the United States, and that's where the current debate is on the whole question of cultural and economic rights. And something like, for example, the Equal Rights Amendment, which has probably focused much of this attention. Do women have a right to equal pay for equal work or not? And here we get this great debate. I realize that there's a lot of other issues around that, and people oppose it for a variety of reasons. But it does seem strange that in our own enlightened time, where women are making, 69 cents on a dollar for comparable work with
59.
men. Is it really? Yeah, around. And that just doesn't seem right. That seems a violation of some sort of inherent dignity that women ought to be accorded in our culture. Yet here we get a debate going on that.
It's a perfect example of the developmental kind of thing, it seems to me, Jim. On the one hand, we have this sense that there should not be, and we need to find ways to make this then a reality, there should not be discrimination simply around the issue of sexual difference of masculine feminine. We keep moving more and more firmly and clearly as a society to a conviction that we've got to deal with areas where that exists. At the same time, we live in a world in which in many other societies, culturally, there's not that same kind of conviction at all. So we're saying that we, in the United States, and not only the United States, but many nations, the sensitivity to human rights has developed along to the point that we're convinced we must grapple with that. At the same time, how we work out the particulars of that in economic structures, in legal structures, in a way that adequately protects those rights without infringing on others, that's the cutting edge that we're right at the moment. Some societies in the world haven't even gotten to that yet. There are stages beyond that we haven't gotten to yet ourselves. So I think, for me, it's the kind of thing that illustrates that whole developmental process.
As we're talking about all of this, we can go back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was issued December 10th, 1948 by the General Assembly of the United Nations, and was approved by all of the member states at that time. And in that Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there's a preamble that talks about the importance of the rights of all people, all members of the human family, that people have dignity and so on. And then it talks a lot about political rights, and then it gets into a section where there is discussion of the cultural and economic rights as we're talking about. For example, it says, everyone as a member of society has the right to Social Security.
It's a tag word in the U.S.
Yeah, that's right. It means something different, I think, here.
It
says everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment. Article 24, everyone has the right to rest and leisure, including reasonable limitation of working hours and periodic holidays with pay. Article 25, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care. That's one that is controversial.
Very much.
So you see, all the way through these, we have these economic, cultural rights being discussed. This is back in 1948, and is a statement made by all of the members, nations at that time of the United Nations.
What I find, as we're talking about this, is just the parallel, as you say, this is, the Declaration of the UN General Assembly here is not a religious document. It doesn't couch these in any kind of religious framework at all. And yet what strikes me is the tremendous parallel of the reasoning of these documents simply coming from the inherent dignity and rights of human beings simply from being human, and what has been this thread running through our own church social documents over the years of the dignity of the human person as being the core issue that we come back to. We would couch that in that religious framework of created, redeemed, etc. But that sense that inherent in human nature, these are not rights that have to be won, that have to be proved. You're not awarded them for good behavior. They are inherent to being on the face of the earth as a human being.
Think back to our own Constitution or our Declaration of Independence that way, that we hold certain truths to be self-evident, that everybody in the human community ought to be able to see that people have certain unalienable rights. And just the process of reasoning ought to bring us to that. That's been part of our strong Catholic heritage, of course, is what we call the natural law thinking, or the notion that the great God has put an intelligible structure into reality, and that reasonable people are able to determine that structure, that philosophers can probe the human situation and find certain universal and general principles there, and that when we end up doing that, that human reason will lead us to think that, yes, persons are valuable. persons have intelligence and free will, and that therefore they have certain rights and duties that flow from all of this. So we've held all along in our strong Catholic heritage, which celebrates reason and philosophy, the ability of human intelligence to discern the patterns in reality, that we can found the rights that way. That on a natural law kind of basis. That's sort of a flag word, but the way I'm explaining it here, I think, is that there's an intelligible pattern in reality, and that thinking people can discern that. And that when you discern it, you will see that the human person is at the center of the whole thing. That structures and institutions are for the sake of people and not vice versa. We don't have corporations just to exist on their own. We don't have governments for the sake of governments. But we have governments, corporations, economic institutions, cultural life for the sake of the people.
For the well-being
Persons
of the people.
are at the center of all of that. And so our great claim is that you can figure that out just by a process of reason. And of course, that is substantiated when you look at this Universal Declaration of Human Rights put out by the United Nations, signed by supposedly atheistic governments like the Soviet system, and coming up with this kind of perception of the world, that that no one can be discriminated against according to sex, race, national origin, and so on.
The idea that in contrast to that rights are not arbitrary, that they are not there only so long as a government or some other power structure chooses to grant them or revoke them, as the case may be, that they're not arbitrary. The other is the whole sense that as rights, I'm thinking of that whole thing that comes up frequently in discussion of rights in the United States, is the interplay between rights and responsibilities. That the experience of the human community seems to be to say one way that you destroy rights is by not using them, by not acting on. A perfect example in the United States is the right to vote. And in a presidential election, a few weeks ago, something like 60% of the potential electorate in the United States voted. The best way possible to erode any right is not to exercise it and to not act on it. And so it kind of has an inherent dynamism to it that the minute you start to proclaim it, you had better act on it, because if you don't, the more you proclaim it without acting on it, the more it becomes empty. It becomes a piece of paper.
I think it's vitally important to put together rights and duties, or rights and responsibilities and obligations. In fact, I think you could say that for every right, there is a corresponding duty. And so that you have a right, as the Declaration says, to found a family, there's a corresponding duty for parents to raise the children well, to care for them, and so on. You have a right to education, according to this Declaration. At the same time, you have a duty then to take advantage of those opportunities that you have in school to study and to make the most of it. So you can go right down the line and point out that the duties have to be part of it. And I suppose when you extend that analysis, one of the most important duties we have of all is to ensure the rights of all the other people. Because you can't talk about rights in a vacuum or only in individualistic terms. I think that has been a mistake. We need to talk about rights in terms of community, of solidarity, of belonging to larger organizations, whether they are the so-called middle organizations, subsidiary ones like labor unions or self-help programs or whatever, or whether the larger group is governmental. But that has to be put into a social context. And as soon as you say that, then you recognize we have duties to respect the rights of others. So if we have the right to vote, and we think that's important, then it's important for us to make sure that it actually is there for other people, so that people aren't kept away from the polls in arbitrary ways, or aren't coerced into not voting or to voting a certain way, and so on.
The way that social structures color the exercise or the possibility of exercising rights is important, because to say that these rights flow inherently from human persons, from human nature, from human dignity is one thing. But the actual exercise of those rights, whether or not those rights are operative, is largely determined by whether people together in society do acknowledge and make possible the exercise of those. And it's a little tricky. It's not to say that, in effect, the right really only comes from society giving it to you. It's to say the right is inherent, but whether or not that moves from a theory to an operative kind of reality is whether or not built into society there are the structures that enable the exercise of those rights. And if they're not, then it becomes merely paper. To say that there is a right to vote But if there are social structures that make that impossible, then it's kind of tricky to talk about the right.
The Soviet system is a good example of this.
Example.
So that they've signed this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and so there's supposed to be the right to vote and so on, but what does it amount to in the Soviet Union? I mean, they go through the paperwork and so on, and as high 99% of the people vote or something, but it doesn't mean anything because there aren't any real options involved. And so that I think your point is well taken, that the way the society is structured has so much to do with this. And what we're trying to do, I guess, always is get institutions, systems, structures to be more responsive to people, to people's real rights and needs and duties. And in many times throughout the world, that is exactly what doesn't exist. And you could put forward all of the totalitarian systems from the rightist regimes in Latin America through Eastern Europe and the Soviet bloc and so on, where these things simply are not operative in any real sense because the system simply precludes that.
I think there's maybe another dimension to saying that these are inherent in human nature and in human dignity. It's also to say that rights only exist and become operative if human persons work to make that happen. The Declaration only exists because a sufficient number of people in the right place at the right time determined to put down in writing and try to gain, the support of other people, be they individuals or representatives of governments for that.
That's back in 1948 you're talking about. The name of Eleanor Roosevelt comes to my mind as a woman who had a whole lot to do with this, making sure that this document saw the light of day. And I think also the historical context of coming out of the Second World War experience with its barbarisms and with the Holocaust experience and so on probably moved people to be ready to make those kinds of assertions in favor of the rights of all people.
Civil rights in the United States might be an example. We say that civil rights came to be a reality because such and such laws were passed. But those laws were only passed because specific individual people wrote up legislation, pushed it through state and federal legislatures. In other words, ultimately it comes down to a human question. If human beings work to create structures that enhance and protect rights, they'll be protected. If not, rights are not self-sustaining. They are inherently dependent on human action to move them.
I think to take up your example, we have to give a large play, too, to the whole civil rights movement with its sit-ins and its nonviolent approaches to trying to change laws, the willingness of Dr. Martin Luther King to go to jail and to write a letter from the Birmingham jail and so on. All of these things have a role to play. The same way that you have a whole history in the economic sphere of the establishment of the labor unions in the United States. I think if we're thinking of the role of the church in all of this, in some ways with the church working with the immigrant populations in the 19th century, the turn of the century and so on, it seemed to be a very positive role of helping the laboring person in the United States to get organized, to get some leverage and power vis-a-vis the larger industrialists and the corporations. So that, again, you need sometimes the catalyst. You need the prophetic figure. You need the organization to make sure this begins to happen. Sometimes churches have done that, and sometimes I think churches have been actually retarding the process of human rights. But in our own country, when you think of the role of the church with the laboring person, I think it's a pretty proud kind of history.
I think a part of that also then is the question of how do you maximize who and what kinds of people are caught up in that process. In other words, if the job of stating, of supporting, of legislating, of protecting, of enhancing rights is only left to a small segment of the community, it seems to me the end product is not as thorough as it is if you have the people themselves whose lives, whose rights, whose concerns are involved, if you have them somehow able to be a part of the process. In the United States, a large part of that is obviously through the electoral process and a voting system. But participation in voluntary organizations, example of the civil rights movement. There were people who helped move the question of voting rights specifically for blacks in the South along by working within the political process. They spent far more time in caucus meetings and state legislatures than they ever did on the streets in sit-ins. But there were other people who never got inside a state legislature in their life, but were involved in it, in a more public way. I'm saying that both of those, it seems to me, are essential to say that there's no legitimate process for citizen involvement in dealing with rights except through established political channels is, I think, limiting. That's a structure that we need to use and use much more effectively, but there's a whole broad spectrum, of involvement kinds of things that have to happen to enhance rights.
Of course, in the United States, we have the opportunity for a wide variety of ways of going about it, through the courts, through influencing public opinion, and so on. That's one of the great structural strengths of our system. If you play that off again against the totalitarian regimes where public opinion isn't a reality, where it is hard, at least, for anybody to influence the system, although we could think of the Russian dissident, Sakharov, and so on, who's trying to work for human rights in his own country, but it becomes a minority voice. So in our country, I think that there is a great variety of opportunities. I think where we are missing the boat on the economic rights and so on is that, from our viewpoint of church people, is that we haven't played that up enough. We are not aware of the large body of literature coming, say, out of our Catholic community on the question of human rights. The great example of this is the great encyclical by Pope John the 23rd, commonly known as Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, where the first part of this talks about human rights. And in there, he talks about the right to life and a worthy standard of living, rights pertaining to moral and cultural values, rights to worship God according to one's conscience, thing that doesn't happen a lot, right to freely choose one's state of life, and then a section on economic rights, talking about the right of the human person to work without coercion, the right to demand working conditions in which physical health is not endangered, morals are safeguarded, and young people's normal development is not impaired. Women have the right to working conditions in accordance with their requirements and their duties as wives and mothers. You think of all of the questions now about women's working rights and pregnancy and so on. It's, in a way, what we failed to do, say, looking especially at our Catholic community, is educate our people to this kind of thing. It's interesting, Pacem in Terris has been studied by all kind of people around the world, and all kind of secular groups that continue to take this encyclical as a basis for serious discussion, and yet in our Catholic community, this great encyclical of John the 23rd largely remains unknown, and here we have all this talk about rights in here, and corresponding duties that we really need to bring out, help people to know about.
In that document, in several, certainly, of the following documents, in inherently American structures like, as we just were discussing in parishes recently, the Campaign for Human Development, this connection between issues of peace and justice, kind of that slogan thing, in fact, the Campaign for Human Development is used, if you want peace, work for justice. That inherent sense that there cannot be peace within anything from a family to a national society to the world community if systematically and in a widespread way fundamental human rights are not protected by just legislation, by just economic structures. The idea that there can be peace in a world that is riddled with injustice is almost one of those self-evident kinds of things. There cannot be. And that working for peace is much more than just the explicit issue of the arms race or militarization. It is that whole question of all of those areas of the human community, that everything from right literally to life and to food to rights to education, right to participation in the political process, unless those are protected and held up, there can't be peace.
Yeah, and as you said, it's sort of self-evident, and yet a thing that is often missed. No, and our bishops in their first draft of the pastoral letter on economics take up this whole thing, and they have this idea. It says there's a lot of obstacles to creating justice economically in our country. We've got our problems, our pockets of unemployment. We've got people who are working and not making any kind of minimum wage and so on, people living below the poverty level. They say got a lot of problems and obstacles to overcome. But he said we must begin with the formation of a new cultural consensus, and I'm quoting now from the first draft, that all persons really do have rights in the economic sphere, and that society has a moral obligation to take the necessary steps to ensure that no one among us is hungry, homeless, unemployed, or otherwise denied what is necessary to live with dignity. And then the bishops call in this for a new American experiment, it says. Said we've made progress in the political sphere, now we've got to try to make similar progress in the whole towards what they call economic democracy, creation of an order that guarantees the minimum conditions of human dignity in the economic sphere for every person. So, it seems to me that this really is, an important step forward with all of this.
Yeah. I think as we look at that in our own country, it's with a sense that we need to be deeply in touch with what has happened to develop the kind of structures that protect those rights in our own society. Certainly I would hold our own up to any other society in the world as having done a tremendously good job of that. But there's also the tendency then to assume that we've done it perfectly. That the incidental pockets of things that aren't quite perfect here and there are minimal. And the need to be honest enough about our own system to realize that as any economic or cultural system, it has to be continually critiqued in the light of some kind of standard of justice. And I'm kind of happy to see the bishop's document, coming out as a piece around which to talk about that.
Chuck, we've been talking about this whole area of human rights, and in a sense it's a slippery one. The word is abstract in itself, and yet I think we have to try to see it in concrete ways. We're talking about the right to participate in the full cultural life of the community, to make minimum wage, for a person to make enough money to put the bread on the table and to have opportunities to live a decent standard of living. And that, what we're saying, of course, is that that's a right, that it's inherent in the fact that human beings have dignity and worth. Out of our Christian tradition, we insist that that's because every human being is uniquely called by God. God knows everyone by their name, and because of that, they possess this dignity and worth. And with this dignity and worth comes certain rights, and as you well pointed out, we have to work constructively to try to ensure those rights.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Father Charles Ritter, director of the Office of Community Relations for the Diocese of Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was human rights, economical and social. Comments or questions on this show or suggestions for future topics should be sent to Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program provided by the Catholic Communications Campaign of the Diocese of Toledo.